to the discussion that basically believe that one, people are entitled to security, basically the people who are armed to the teeth with an arsenal of all sorts of weapons of mass destruction, while the victim, the primary victim of the Arab-Israeli conflict, requires no security assurances at all. Maybe a mini state under the thumb of the Israeli occupation soldier, but not security assurances.
Well, Jeffrey Aronson in Washington, D.C., let's put that point to him. Do you see any problem in terms of one side being given security and not the other?
No, certainly the equation has to define and accommodate the legitimate security interests of either side if we're to achieve any sort of framework which enhances stability and reduces the prospect of conflict in the future. That's understood. The critical point here is, I think, as we look back at this meeting in 3 or 5 years, I think the most memorable point will be Obama's endorsement and public approval of Israel's nuclear deterrent. This is, in some respects, unprecedented. It certainly overshadows the sort of more tactical atmospherics about good feeling and so forth. It certainly overshadows the fact that the Obama administration has, at least rhetorically, retreated from its previous insistence on a complete, total, and substantive, durable settlement freeze. President Obama spoke in his meeting a month ago with Mahmoud Abbas about simply curbing Israeli settlement expansion. This suggests a return to language of previous administrations, under which, as we all know, settlement expansion proceeded apace. So if we're looking for, in a sense, a new departure here, it's, I think, in this strategic dimension. And I think as we're looking forward, it merits full attention to the extent to which Israel and the U.S. are going to attempt to be on the same strategic and security page as we move forward. And to the extent that they are, I think this will prejudice the Palestinian prospects of putting their agenda on the table.
Brett Stevens in New York, you mentioned earlier that Israel has responded better in the past to good relations rather than pressure. Yet some observers would argue that the times at which Israel has been persuaded to pursue the peace process has been under George Bush, for example, then also under the Jimmy Carter presidency, both leaders whom put a great deal of pressure onto Israel at particular times. How does that hold with your argument?
Well, ultimately, the Camp David Accords of the late 1970s were agreed not from Carter administration pressure, but from Carter administration inducements. It's true that the first George H.W. Bush administration put pressure on Israel, but that also followed directly after the first Gulf War, in which the United States appeared to have demolished one of Israel's principal rivals. Look, this is a classic case where a drop of honey does a lot more than a gallon of gall, as Abraham Lincoln was fond of saying. Israel, whatever the perceptions of my colleague in Beirut, Israel believes it is a small and besieged state. That is simply the psychological reality, and I believe it's the actual reality, that peacemakers need to deal with. The psychology that Israel has very few friends in the world except the United States. So if anyone wants to be realistic about peacemaking, that psychology needs to be taken fully into account, as well as I think what the strategic reality is that Israel faces. And I would just add, Mike, if I may, I would be curious to hear from my colleague in Beirut whether he thinks that Israel has any legitimate security concerns that he can name. And furthermore, if Israel is such a criminal state, as he puts it, why has it not then used its nuclear arsenal already?
Assad, your answer?
Well, I mean, the answer is simple. First of all, I do not believe Israel has a right to exist as a racist, oppressive, and warmongering state that it has. I do believe that the Palestinian people should have the right to liberate their land and to establish a secular democratic state, neither Islamic nor Jewish, where everybody of all faiths can coexist together. So certainly I am not for peace with that kind of state. More importantly, he wants us to give a blender or some medal to the state of Israel because it has used all these weapons over the years and has launched invasions successively on Lebanon and other countries and bombed all these countries that I listed to the listeners and viewers, and yet, because it has not yet used nuclear weapons, we should applaud and thank poor little Israel for that deed. I mean, if this is the level of praise that Israel requires, I mean, I think that we're entering the theater of the absurd. I think that clearly the kind of peace that the United States and Israel have in mind is a process that have facilitated, encouraged, and allowed for Israel to continue in its war deeds and record for the last 30 years unabated. And if that's what peace process is all about, it seems to me we should not be shy to say we don't want any more of that kind of peace.
Well, let's just get a final thought from Jeffrey Aronson in Washington briefly. And the question is, would there be a point at which this close relationship with Israel would infringe on what are the national security interests of the United States?
Well, it's always possible, and as we know over the past months, there have been suggestions that this is in fact the case. However, I point out that there have historically been voices within the U.S. national security community who have argued since the late 40s that the alliance with Israel, or that the idea that there's some sort of identity of strategic views between Israel and the U.S. is mistaken. Historically, these voices have not won the day internally, and we haven't, I don't think, yet reached that critical point where in fact there's that kind of overall reassessment. However, having said that, to the extent that solving this problem is defined as a vital national security interest of the U.S., as President Obama has done, there need to be policy consequences to that assessment, and that requires a change in the U.S. view permitting Israel to retain the territorial assets that it has enjoyed over the last 40-plus years since its occupation of the West Bank and other areas.
Well, my thanks to our guests, Jeffrey Aronson in Washington, D.C., Brett Stevens in New York, and Asad Abukhalil in Beirut. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.